Appreciate you being here this morning. Thanks to David for teaching my class last Sunday. We were in Jacksonville, Florida at our granddaughter's birthday. That was a wild trip, so we're glad to be back. We did very much. Okay, we're going to look at hopefully two books, maybe not get all the way through, but Obadiah. They're small, minor prophet books, Obadiah and Jonah. Probably the most familiar book in the minor prophets would be Jonah. I usually, in my Hebrew class, that's the book that we begin reading after I take them through Hebrew grammar 1 and 2. We read the book of Jonah together in Hebrew, and I keep telling my students, I said, this is what little kids, begin reading in Jerusalem, is the book of Jonah. So I don't want any whining or complaining, about how hard it is. It doesn't do it again. Still whining and complaining.
You can tell he's an easy language.
So, but we're going to look at Obadiah. Obadiah is interesting. Not much we know about him. There's some Obadiahs that are mentioned in the Old Testament. But it's one that is the smallest Old Testament book. And it has an interesting, lesson in regard to people who enjoy the downfall of others. That's not a good thing to enjoy another person's catastrophe. Even though you think, sometimes depending on political elections and things that happen, and maybe, evil gets caught doing something and there's destruction and all that, we kind of want to go, yeah, but the object lesson seems to be, at least from Obadiah, that the downfall of bad people, the downfall of individuals that have been somewhat judged by God, is actually an object lesson for everyone. And so from that standpoint, it is not a good thing to rejoice in the downfall of others, but to be reminded that it could have been you. And I think that's a good message. It's hard, I think, as individuals and as human beings to sometimes accept that reality, but it is a spiritually mature thing to do. But anyway, Obadiah, in regard to his message, it's very simple. It's a message that seems to be for the people of Judah, but it's concerning a relative of Jacob, and that is Esau. And the Edomites are descendants of Esau. And you're familiar in the Old Testament, there's somewhat a conflict between those two large families of Jacob and Esau. And later in the narrative of Genesis, though, there is some reconciliation at the end, but we find when you read the history of Israel and Judah, there's always some skirmishes that are going on between these two cousins, these family members that evidently cannot really get along with each other and have some animosity to each other. One of the reasons I think there's animosity, all of these nations that are around Israel somewhat connected to Israel in many ways. When we go through the descendants of the patriarchs and all that, you have, the sons, and these are the, Edomites, and these are the so-and-sos, and these are the so-and-sos. They're all kind of related if you go back far enough. But it's a feudal type of relationship that they have with Israel, and it probably stems back to the idea that God chose them, and Israel took that as being special and more special than anybody else. And, when people lift themselves up like that, you have somewhat of a negative attitude toward them. And no doubt that was some of the reasons that I think caused some of the conflicts. It's like, Joseph and his brothers. You have Joseph that has the many-colored coat. He's young. He's told to go check on his brothers. There seems to be some elevation and love for this one named Joseph, and so the brothers just despised him. And, they sold him into slavery. They put him in a pit, told Daddy that, he'd been eaten by wild animals. So there's something, and you realize that as human beings, you kind of have a negative reaction to people who, are arrogant, somewhat self-important. There's not a good relationship when that occurs, and you're somewhat standoff, and you talk about the individual, and you don't want to be around them because it's all about themselves. So you can see on a national level more people that can happen between nations. Some nations being, feeling that they're at a disadvantage, and this nation's being elevated, makes them somewhat not very nice to each other. So that's what we find in Obadiah. But there came a time in Israel's history, particularly Judah, even though we don't have a captivity, we're not at captivity yet, there were times in the nation in which they were, overran by people. And God punished them. They didn't take them automatically into captivity at a certain time. They reached the point when, you guys need to be punished for 70 years or going into Assyrian captivity. So at different points when there were bad kings or, bad leaders, God would allow foreign nations to come in and sort of, ravage the people to get them to call on him again. And there's an instance in which Judah, under a certain king, I think it's Jehoram, who wasn't a very, very nice guy. The description of his death is really kind of tragic. You can read about it in 2 Chronicles there. I have the listing there. But some suggest that it might be during this time that we find Judah being raised by these foreign entities, and Edom, their cousins, the Edomites, just watching until the lowest and weakest point of their demise, and then the Edomites rushed in and took advantage of their humiliation. So took the spoils, took other things, and the prophet Obadiah is God's response to that attitude. Say, Judah deserved it. Well, maybe so, but there's something sinister about rejoicing someone's comeuppance, or someone's demise, and then you exploiting it for your own benefit and purpose. And that seems to be what the Edomites did. One of the things that Edom, you're familiar with, you've heard of Petra, and when you look at the Edomites, they're kind of the Transjordan area. You have the area of Perea, and then there's the southern part, and you have Petra, and you have all these high mountains, rocky and cliffs, and they had a very good strategic, place to live. It was hard to conquer the Edomites because of the cliffs and the rocks. It was hard to plunder them because they hid their spoils and they hid valuable things in secret crevices or cuts in the cliffs that only they knew about. So they had a pretty good way of protecting themselves. And they took pride in that. They could rush and go and create havoc over here, and run back to their place and hide and get on the cliffs, and they would have the high ground. When you've seen maybe movies like what's the one? There's the series you probably remember. How come I can't think about it? Has the ark and Yeah, Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, and I think it's the last one or something like that where they're in Petra, and Harrison Ford and all them, and there's these big mountains, and there's this, you know, crevice that they have horses, and they go in. You can only kind of like go one at a time, and so you can see having the high ground. Any intruder that comes, you know, you got, you know, the arrow's going to be pretty accurate because you got them pinned in these little crevices where one could not maneuver or hide. You're just kind of exposed. They took pride in that, and that was what protected them. And instead of putting their trust in God's protection, they put their trust in living where they were in that area. And that's talked about in Obadiah, how, you know, they might build up here nests as eagles, you know, and take pride, but guess who can bring you down? God can. And God did. You know, the Edomites were eventually judged and taken over. So I want to read a little bit of Obadiah, and I want you to notice the sinister nature, I think, of the Edomites in taking advantage of Judah. So, the vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. Remember, the name Edom is the nation of the Edomites, and they come from Esau, you know, Jacob and Esau. Sometimes the nation is spoken to as if it was a person, you know. And so keep that in mind as you read the prophets, because there will be a conversation between God and Edom, or God and Esau. And that name is representing the nation, okay, sort of like in a conversation. So we have heard a report from the Lord, and an envoy has been sent among the nations, saying, Arise, let us go against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. The word behold, as we have indicated before, is a word used for immediacy. That is, when Hebrew uses that word, it is to grab the attention that there's an immediate urgency to what's happening here. And so it's an attention grabber. If you were a Jew or a reader of Hebrew or whatever, you would connect that these things are, you know, from the standpoint of God, it's immediate and it's urgent, and this is going to happen. I will make you small among the nations. You are greatly despised. The arrogance of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock, in the loftiness of your dwelling place, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to earth? You always got to be careful if anybody ever says things like that, you know. I'm on the top of my game. No one's going to bring me down. You know, I can do anything I want. I mean, there's people who talk like that. It can be deceiving. Sometimes we can think that. Maybe things are going so well, and you begin to deceive yourself that, you know, I'm in control of everything. And it only takes a twinkle of the eye to change everything. It's like, I think of Saul of Tarsus. He was on the top of his game, wasn't he? He was persecuting Christians. He was rising up as a star in Judaism. He even had the respect of those who were the leaders and the priests and all that, gave him letters of authority to, you know, even go up to Damascus, the northern part of Israel, well, even out of Israel, to find these people who were believed to be heretics of Judaism. But on his way, something happened that was unexpected, you know. Jesus revealed himself to him, and his whole world was turned upside down. I mean, a completely shift from being high on the hog at one time, and then all of a sudden, his destination has changed forever, and he realized everything that he has been doing has been against God. That's got to be a sobering reality, to think you're doing the right thing, and then you learn you're not. Have you ever been in that situation? you thought you were doing the right thing, and you learn you weren't. You know? And it just changes your attitude, your actions, kind of humbles you a little bit. Well, Saul, I guess, needed a little humbling, and the nation of the Edomites need humbling as well. But be careful about making any kind of statements of that. Always kind of don't want to say it because you're setting yourself up. You know, you don't want to set yourself up. I think as a person, you know, I don't want to make statements like that. That, you know, the next day it's kind of like, yeah, we see what happened to you. You're really arrogant, and now look at you. So, though you build high like the eagle, this is in verse 4, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. A New Testament passage to the one who thinks that he stands, what? Take heed, lest he fall. It's that kind of thing. You want to try to avoid the confidence that is external to the Lord. Putting our confidence in the Lord gives us a certain, not arrogance, but an attitude that we'll talk about in this morning's sermon. But it gives us a fortitude about us, perseverance, that we can go through. Our dependence is upon God. That's different. That's not arrogance. That's faith. Arrogance is one who puts confidence or, you know, overemphasizes self and external things in regard to the absence of God. It's kind of like the book of Ecclesiastes when it says, you know, vanity of vanity, you know, all is vanity under the sun. That's the idea of one living their life separate and apart from God. You know, there's nothing to life. You might as well not have been born if you're going to live that way, because you've just thrown away opportunity because you're living for self and you're not living aligned with God. And that's why the book of Ecclesiastes would end, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of the human being. So, continue reading. He says, if thieves came to you, if robbers by night, oh, how you will be ruined. See, they took pride in the fact that thieves and robbers, that is, outside forces, had no chance in their, you know, location because of the, you know, strategic placement of where they were in their home. Oh, how you will be ruined. Would they not steal only until they had enough? A grape gatherers come to you. Would they leave some gleanings? Oh, how Esau will be ransacked. I think this is kind of funny. He says, you know, if a thief comes to you, you think he's going to kind of leave anything? You know? If someone's going to ransack you, this is another way of saying you're going to lose it all. I love how Scripture sometimes uses sarcasm, ways of expression to make its point. So the point is, you won't have, you know, one little thing left. It's going to be that bad for you when God judges you. So he says, oh, how Esau will be ransacked and his hidden treasure searched out. See, that means more if you know what the Edomites did. They hid their treasure where? In the clefts and rocks and stuff like that nobody could find. But what does God say? It doesn't matter where you hide. Your hidden treasure's going to be searched out. It'll be found. Yes? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't, that's one of the places that I wanted to go was to see, they have dwellings carved into the rock, and it's very interesting what they were able to do. And so their confidence from a military standpoint, or from the confidence of a nation, they learned how to live in that terrain. And it gave them a measure of advantage against their enemies. But you have no advantage when God sets his face against you. There's no advantage. And they had reached the point to where judgment was coming upon them. So, oh, how Esau again will be ransacked. See, that's a statement that Esau or the Edomites would reject. Okay? Their hidden treasures will be found out. All the men allied with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. They who eat your bread will set an ambush for you. There is no understanding in him. This parenthetical statement, at least in my translation, I have it in parentheses. There will be no understanding him. Do y'all have parentheses there? Okay, it is a parenthetical statement. What it's meaning is Edom doesn't realize that what they did to Israel is happening to them. And God is judging them. Other nations are deceiving them, playing their friend. Hey, we're friends with you. And they draw the Edomites and various people out of their location. They ambush them. The places that were the most secure are traps for the Edomites. And so they are deceived by their allies, by their friends. There's nothing worse than to realize that those who have been closest to you have turned out to be your enemies. Talk about betrayal, right? So this is the destination of this nation. He says, verse 8, will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy wise men from Edom? Now this is interesting because Timah, you remember Eliphaz from Job? He was a Temanite, I guess you would call him. This is one of the areas of the Edomites, a location. They were known of having wise men. Many people are who were elevated as great wise people were associated with this particular location. And so when you know that particular background, then God is saying, I'm going to destroy even the wise. It's a full onslaught of judgment. No matter the good that they have done, no matter their reputation that they had, it's all going to be knocked down. Block by block, it's going to come down. Cliff by cliff, it's going to fall upon them. Look at, let me see, we're verse 9 again. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountain of Esau? Then your mighty men who will be dismayed, O Timon. Okay, there's the location. So that everyone may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. There's the Hebrew language is kind of interesting. There's no tense in Hebrew. It's like we would have, past tense, future tense, things like that. There's only it's only two types of things. It's either incomplete action or it's completed action. Now you can derive English tenses from that. If something's complete, then we would associate a past tense. But it doesn't have past tense. What they have is certain formations of verbal forms that bring a nuance to the action. Hebrew is an action-oriented language. And one of the stems that we call, there's several different stems when a word's found in this formation. It could be an active verb or a passive. Hebrew also has what's called, I guess you could say it's an intensity. It's like if you have one verb, the word to kill, in the regular type of formation, it means to kill. If you put it in the intensive form, it means to slaughter. If you have a verb, an action verb that means to break, I broke something. But if you put it in the intensive form, it's like you smashed it. Okay? There's a difference. It's the nuances that are interesting. And so these kind of nuances are being used, in talking about the destruction and downfall of the Edomites. And so you have the intensity. It's not that you're going to be killed. You'll be slaughtered. It's not that people are going to come and take some of your stuff. You're going to be raised, overcome completely. So this is intensive action but it's going to be God causing this. God's behind it. Verse 10, because of violence to your brother Jacob. Okay, here's the reason now. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. So, a true family feud, right? The descendants of Esau and Jacob, the Edomites and Judah. There is a feud. And so, when Judah was being raised, was being judged and all that, the Edomites were, they stood aloof. They had, what was missing from them? Compassion. What else? I mean, how can you be so cold as a human being as to not have any empathy? Even if the person is terrible. Look what's happening to this human being. Do you not have any empathy? No, I don't, man. They deserve what they get. That's sort of the attitude. People deserve. It's justice. Well, we may think like that, and it may be true. They do deserve. But there's something about the nature of God who shows compassion. Who shows compassion. While we were yet sinners, what happened? While we were spitting in Christ's face, while we were mocking him, while we were beating him, while we were, sarcastically putting a crown on his head, and, yeah, you're the Christ, and, all this as human beings were doing, it was the plan of God. Often, God is the God of compassion. This is one of the reasons that when we get to the book of Jonah, God has compassion for the outsider. The Ninevites. People who were known to be cruel in battle and putting people in captivity and various things. Now, there's a rise and the fall of the Assyrians, and we're probably at the point of Nineveh to where they were experiencing some weakness, and it was scaring the people. So that might be a reason why they responded to Jonah's preaching, because they took it as an omen or a message. They had to do something because they felt things crumbling underneath their feet. I don't know, but go ahead. Yeah. 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 So what you're saying is that we shouldn't be like Edomites toward our brothers and sisters in Christ. Absolutely. That's correct. If we can't as John would say, use the word love on the positive side. If we can't love one another, then we certainly are not going to love, others outside. I mean, this is the testing ground or the ground to grow into what God wants us to be. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, verse 10, because of the violence of your brother, you stood aloof. You had no shame. You carried away, as you saw them carrying away the wealth of your brother, foreigners entered the gate and cast lots for Jerusalem. You too were as one of them. Now, they were as one of them. They were associated with them. And they were associated with them, a lot of it because of their attitude. Yeah, they had the actions too, but notice the language is indicating that when others were doing this, and when others were involved in this, you were as one of them, like one of them. It is not indicating necessarily that they were actually doing it, but just the association of the attitude is indicating their character. They wanted to be, they rooted for it, they wished they were. That's not a good thing. Continue reading. He says, do not gloat over your brother's day, the day of his misfortune, and do not rejoice over the sons of Judah and the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast in the day of their distress. Now, you have to know something about how the Bible, how the ancient writers wrote. They wrote in parallel statements a lot for emphasis. Okay, notice the emphasis. It's saying the same thing, but it's saying it in different ways. That's kind of like underlying exclamation point, so you won't miss it. And so we have a lot of this in Scripture to where it almost reads, it has a redundancy to it. You ever notice sometimes there's a lot of what we would call redundancy? Well, the redundancy is the technique of emphasis. See, I write on students' paper a lot. This is redundant. You already said it. You mark it through. Like you're padding the paper. Sometimes I mark whole paragraphs. It's kind of like they saying it in a different way. They said the same thing. Redundant. Well, I couldn't do that to an ancient author. Okay, because that is the way that language was done. Through the use of parallelisms, what we might think is redundant is their way of bringing focused attention to the situation. So listen again to the parallel statements. So he says, do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Do not gloat over the calamity in the day of their disaster. And do not loot their wealth in the day of their, what? Disaster. See the repetition? That's underlining, bold, italicized, and exclamation point. So, when you read that way and you understand the nature of another language being translated into English, it doesn't follow English rules. See? And so, what we might think as a long statement of redundancy or whatever, saying the same thing, is it really saying anything different? No, it's just emphasizing the nature of the point that God is making. Now, verse 15, for the day of the Lord draws near on all nations. As you have done, it will be what? Done to you. It's somewhat of a statement of pause for us, of thinking before we act, because there could be a real situation in which we're setting our own trap. I'm always find it interesting how politicians call others out on things when we then learn that what they were calling others out on, they themselves have been doing it for years, right? So you stand on the moral high ground, and you're all arrogant, and you point. It's like all this has happened in our culture and the cancel stuff. All the people who are saying, oh, this is so bad what you did. You need to be canceled. You need to be fired. If you go into those people's life, you'll find exactly the same thing that they're condemning others for. You know? And usually, those who are the greatest defenders or the accusers are the ones who are the worst culprits of what they're accusing others of doing. That's the way they defend themselves, to keep the attention off of them. So, there's a little pause that one ought to have of like, Paul would say that we need to, season our speech a little bit with what? Salt. Think before you speak. So our mother was right, think before you speak. Pause. Take a pause in the judgments that you make. We shouldn't be people who are reactive to things. Being reactive, knee-jerk reaction, is often a wrong assessment of the situation. A knee-jerk reaction. You know what that is, right? What's a knee-jerk reaction? Yeah, immediate, based upon none of the facts. Something was said, and it's a knee-jerk judgment or reaction. You got to be careful about that, because often that is not the full picture of things. It's often like what the news does. Something happens, a beating, a shooting, or whatever. There's a knee-jerk reaction, racism. Then we get all the facts a month or two later, and we find out that it wasn't that at all, was it? Or there's something else that happens. See, our country's a knee-jerk reactor. And it's not wait till all the facts come in. It's like judgment now, it's terrible. But that's what the concern is, and what we have to avoid in being God's people. It's amazing how God has allowed so much to go on. It's almost as if to show everyone his patience, but also that the judgment shown is valid. There was a point in which the land of promise was not ready for the Israelites to go into it, because the sin of the Canaanites was not yet what? Y'all ever read that? God held off of certain things because he was waiting for the sin of the Canaanites to reach maturity, so to speak. And then there would be, in other words, the delay that he had for the judgment was his patience being shown for any hope whatsoever, anybody, before it happened. And often that's the case. It's not judgment like that. It's kind of like God gave them over to their passions, like Paul would say in Romans 1, gave them over to the depraved attitudes, gave them over to the idols that they would serve, until the fruition and the maturity of their departure showed itself, and then it became an object lesson from the standpoint of God to show judgment against those people as a lesson to everybody around. It's what Paul would say, in 1 Corinthians, when he talked about the things which were done in the past were done for whose learning? Ours, our learning. That we would not crave things as they craved them. We would not go into this as they did. Well, they're serving as object lessons. So the full maturity of their sin is allowed to go. So when their destruction occurs, it will be an object lesson to you. You can't say, well, they weren't really that bad. This is the trajectory, and you don't want to go on that trajectory to where the end result, is destruction, and you're walking in that direction. It may not look bad now. You're right here, but it's right here that's going to be, self-evident to everyone. You might be fooling yourself, and it's just waiting for the maturity of sin to blossom, to give birth, and then everybody knows. And that happens all the time in our culture. So God's pronouncing judgment on them because they have gone away from God. So the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a phrase that's used by probably most all the prophets. Okay, don't always think the day of the Lord is talking about the second coming of Jesus in the Old Testament. Okay, a lot of people, premillennialists and various others, and we can even make that mistake of thinking that the day of the Lord is referring, as New Testament Christians, to the end of time. The day of the Lord has a lot of applications in the Old Testament. It's usually a representation of judgment on one side of the coin, but on the other side of the coin, it's a day of salvation for those who've been faithful. So just be aware of that. Okay. He says, your dealings will return on your head because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they have never existed. But on Mount Zion, now here's where he talks, and this is what's helpful. I mean, Judah got a big spanking. Okay, this wasn't their captivity. This was a skirmish that happened because they had an evil king, and they got spanked real bad with the rod of God. But God comes back and says, now they will be restored, and they will receive blessings from me. I will make it a better days ahead. So listen to what he says. But on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be stubble, and they will set them on fire and consume them. So the very people that you have despised, took advantage of, had no compassion on, will be the very people that will do what? Be involved in your destruction. So you say, well, now it's flipped. How come Jacob is now against Esau? Well, this is the judgment of God. God uses nations, individuals, as a judgment rod against sin. And so the whole message is that you're going to reap what you sow. All of this has New Testament parallels. You're going to reap what you sow. So there's the caution. You sow, bad things. You sow unrighteousness. You sow sin and all that. Then you're going to reap the consequences of those things. Now, you may not see it tomorrow or the next day, but it's going to happen. It will happen. That's just the nature of life and the way God has made things. You can sow good things, and it will bring back to you that which is, better for you. Now, it may be in this lifetime that none of that is fulfilled. It might be at death that we go into heaven, and that's reaping, the benefit of being God's people. So the promise is not that we will be spared things. The promise is you'll reap what you sow. And even on a practical level, that's really true. Go around and frown at people and see how many people smile back at you. You ever done that? Well, some of you do that all the time. You frown and nobody smiles. You say, well, it's an unfriendly world. No, I was playing. But if you smile at everyone, guess what's going to happen? They'll smile back. I mean, it's just inevitable. One of the things I love to do, I don't know, I just think it's funny. I like human nature. But I can extend my hand or I can extend anything out to someone, and 99.9% of the time, what's the person going to do? Going to take it, So I give people stuff, my office, or whatever, just to see if they take it. And they do. And what's that telling us? There's an automatic type of, give. People take, and they're going to end up giving to you. So I've had some, wise guys that try to give me stuff now, or take my joke from me. But anyway, that just shows you the way that we as human beings are. We give to those who give. That there's going to be a natural thing about that. Now, we don't want to give to receive. We give out of the joy of giving. So, that's Obadiah. I thought I'd finish Jonah too, but, just had high hopes. We'll look at that next Sunday. Thank you.